We turn this morning in God's Word to the book of Judges, Judges chapter 11, and we've been working our way through this book, kind of different selections, not chapter by chapter, but looking at some of these judges and trying to recognize the challenges of living in uncertain, kind of morally confused times. And I think as we go through the book of Judges, we're going to see that more and more. This morning we come to Jephthah, and we are going to talk about what it means to live in a kind of a muddied moral situation, and how even sometimes when we try to do what's right, we find ourselves gravitating towards neglect of God and walking away from Him, and in the process to remember again our own need for Christ. A couple of images that I want to show before we read the text. The first is a map. Again, map. This is kind of the central part of Palestine. You can see the Dead Sea there in the bottom, the Jordan River going up and down the middle. One of the things that's pointed out by commentators as they look at Judges, from this point forward in Judges, there's a lot more enemies and a lot less rest. And so the enemies, instead of coming just from like one corner of Israel's borders, now begin to come from both corners. Judges 10 tells us that the Philistines, who are to the west, so the left side of the map, start attacking, and the Ammonites, who live in kind of that green area to the east, are attacking from the other side. Now, today's story of Jephthah takes place in what's called Gilead, which is the right hand, the east bank of the Jordan River, so the right-hand side of your map. He is centered in Mizpah, which is where all those lines kind of come together, the purple line and the blue line and the yellow line. The Ammonite raiders come from the east, and they are oppressing Israel at this time. And Jephthah is the kind of the hero of the moment who's going to oppose them. So you can see a little bit, again, I'm not going to go into where the lines are moving, but you can see a little bit of the geography that we're working with this morning. And then just a picture to kind of set this in your mind as well. This is what the east bank of the Jordan River looks like, at least that part of where Jephthah is. And so again, you can get an appreciation for some of the landscape. It's kind of a rugged but beautiful landscape, and this will come into play too. We'll read about Jephthah's daughters and running off into the hills and kind of mourning with some of her friends as well. So again, just to get a picture of the landscape in the back of your minds. With that, let's turn to God's Word this morning. Jephthah, Judges 11. We'll read the first 8 verses, and then we'll skip over some and pick up the story at the end of the chapter. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You're not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." So Jephthah fled from his brothers, settled in the land of Tob, where a group of adventurers gathered around him and followed him. Sometime later, when the Ammonites made war in Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." And then the story kind of progresses. They work out the details, and then Jephthah sends some messengers to the king of Ammon, basically saying, "Stop bothering us." And the king of Ammon says, "Well, we want your land. It's really our land." And Jephthah gives them a long history of how Israel came to have the land and said God really gave it to us. And the king of Ammon, in verse 28, ignores that, and we pick up the story here in verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer to the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel-Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites." "But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said. And he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, it was a promise. It was a dumb promise, but it was a promise nonetheless. I will give to the Lord whatever comes out to my house to meet me when I return in triumph. In fact, I'll offer it as a sacrifice. Now, even acknowledging that Jephthah quite likely lived in a house where the barn was attached to the home, as was the case in many houses of the day, what was Jephthah thinking? Was it his prize cow that was going to be the first to hear about his triumph and come out to congratulate him? Jephthah, come on. What were you thinking? Were you thinking? The story of Jephthah, like so many others in Judges, leaves us scratching our heads. Makes for rather tortured reading. It demonstrates the perils of trying to live your life without an operational moral compass. Now we'll see that more and more as we get towards the end of the book, as the narrator begins to summarize over and over again the problem that we see in the book of Judges. In those days, everyone did whatever they wanted. But even by those standards, Jephthah's actions seem pretty crazy. Did he really sacrifice his daughter? Just because he made a crazy and foolish promise? Does Jephthah really think that honesty should trump murder? Questions of those make us wonder why stories like Jephthah's make it into the Bible. Some commentators have tried to redeem Jephthah's rash vow by taking his promise to dedicate whatever came from his house and separating that from the promise to make a burnt offering. So maybe he could have, instead of offering his daughter as a sacrifice, just dedicated her to the Lord for life. Well, it's possible. I mean, the Bible does seem to emphasize at the end of the chapter that she never married, rather than the fact that she was sacrificed. But even just a straightforward reading of the text seems to suggest that it could easily have been something much worse that happened to her. What's even more unfortunate is that Jephthah, according to the laws of Moses, it seems, could have redeemed his daughter from his rash vow. Leviticus 27 provides a way for people to be released from vows that they made with persons in their lives, especially by giving a monetary gift. And of course, even if Jephthah were ignorant of that, he could have let the curse fall on himself rather than taking the consequence out on his daughter. Jephthah, in essence, sacrifices his daughter to protect himself, either for his monetary good or for his word or some of both. In doing so, he shows what he thinks God is like. God is vengeful. God is bloodthirsty. God is demanding. God is angry, just like all the gods of all the other nations. What were you thinking, Jephthah? Were you thinking? The sad story reveals to us something of the way that our sinful thinking and our ignorance of God's will can cloud our judgment when it comes to life issues and any other issues as well. But we're dealing this morning with an issue of life, aren't we? As we read together earlier, as Faith and Dorothy read for us, Christians acknowledge that life is a gift from God's hand, who created all things. Yet when we forget that context, in which we are called to operate, that it's a gift, that this is something God has given us, we easily lose sight, too, of the true God, and we begin to base our ethical decisions instead on the demands of the world's gods. Now, it isn't that Jephthah is totally ignorant of God. He speaks about God regularly, doesn't he? He acknowledges the Lord through his vow. Earlier, the section that we skipped over, verses 14 to 27, Jephthah is reciting the history of God's dealings with Israel, although commentators will point that his theology is a little bit off in those verses already. The problem isn't that Jephthah doesn't know that there's a God out there. The problem is that he doesn't really know that God. He equates the God of Israel with the gods of the nations around, conflates their stories into God's story, and it ends up with a false conception of Israel's Redeemer, a Redeemer who, you really can't quite trust what he's going to do. Jephthah rightly sees God as one who wants us to be faithful to our word, even when it hurts, in the words of Psalm 15. But he mistakenly thinks that such hurt includes injury which clearly contradicts God's will for his people, God's will for life. But this is what happens when we start to fall into an idolatrous conception of God. Idols are not kind to life. We see that in our own day, and especially in the last year, as we try to sort through what it means to have a consistent ethic of life in the face of all sorts of forces that push death upon us. I've read a number of articles recently about the calculations that those in charge of society are trying to make in terms of what's the price of a life that's saved? How does that affect our decisions that we should make about lockdowns and these sorts of things? Most of these articles are economic. They're filled with explanations of terms like the value of a statistical life, or quality adjusted life years, value of a prevented fatality. If you like acronyms, that would be VSLs, QALYs, and VLFs, okay? But the articles are always pointing out the shortcomings of an economic calculus. They said there's so many things that we can't calculate. How do you calculate the value of or the loss that happens when people can't gather to pray, when churches can't meet, when things that give people meaning in life are shut? How do you calculate the cost of mental health struggles that result from children who haven't been out in public in a year? How do you calculate the long-term concerns about freedom or privacy that result from lockdowns, contact tracing, and mandatory vaccinations? How do you balance these things off against how many people would die? And the truth is that idols exist in all corners of our world. There are financial idols that lead us to be scared about any financial impact that would happen when we lock things down. There are idols of physical health and security that keep us from being fearful that anybody might possibly die. And a lot of people have criticized those libertarian impulses that equate people's value in life basically with their economic usefulness, and have resulted then in kind of a nonchalance in some circles about a disease that disproportionately affects older populations. Yet it's ironic that at the same time, there are many in society who might want to spare life here, but have no qualms about expanding rights to abortion or assisted suicide. Genetic engineering, modern idolatry tells us, what better thing than to have a child made in your own image? Embryonic stem cell research promises dramatic increases in medical health, asking only, as Andy Crouch explained in a Christianity Today article some time ago, that we clone and sacrifice human embryos for that cause. Now, some of these ethical decisions are a good reminder why we have a ministry like the CRC's Office of Disability Concerns, to call us to a Christian conception of life, and especially in that ministry's work, a conception of life that's concerned for those who are vulnerable. To recognize that our abilities in life sometimes leave us at a disadvantage when compared to the rest of society, and that we as Christians need to take that seriously and look at that. It's tough in our generation to frame a consistent ethic of life. But you know what? It's not just our generation. You go back in history, the Aztecs of pre-Columbian Mexico were fierce warriors, in part because their gods constantly demanded fresh sacrifices of beating human hearts. Or you go to Europe, the medieval kings and knights were a brutal sort. They weren't above torturing and killing each other to secure a position of power, often in the name of trying to provide space for the God of Christianity to his worship to flourish. No fewer than 6 popes were killed, assassinated in the 10th century, all so that we could have that position of power, influence the institutional church. Or we could go back even farther. The ancient Romans had no problem with spectator sports, where part of the action on the field included the murder of various participants, entertainment that was fueled in part by tax dollars. What we can see is that over the course of history, the particulars might change. But it's hard in any generation to find the moral resources to make decisions, as our contemporary testimony puts it, at life's raw edges. And so the question that we put to Jephthah, what were you thinking? Were you thinking, is a question that has a wider audience than just one man 3,000 years ago. It's a question we have to ask in our own generation as we wrestle with our own issues today. And it's one that we must constantly ask ourselves as we try to embody a Christian ethic of life and integrity. Sadly, Jephthah's dumb promise and his failure to appreciate God's ethic of life actually detracted from the story, the real story of how God was saving his people. I mean, it's really an amazing story, isn't it? God uses Jephthah to relieve Israel of the oppression that they suffered from the Ammonites for a number of years. God takes this guy who's kind of an outcast, been kind of discarded by his own family, and he brings him home and makes him a great leader and a great deliverer. That's an amazing story. But that's not really the story that's told in this chapter. It's dispensed of in a couple of verses. The story that we remember, what sticks out here is that even after his great victory, Jephthah remains a hurting man who ends up hurting others. Beginning with his daughter, and then if we keep reading into chapter 12, we see that it ends up in a civil war with his own countrymen. Spiritually flawed people tend to compensate for their sense of inadequacy by inflicting harm on those around them, taking away from God's story of salvation in the world. And we see the same thing in our own midst, right? Whether it's by physical harm, abuse, neglect, that story takes over, and churches aren't known for their proclamation of Jesus, but for what happened there. Or we could take prejudice or dismissal of people's values that kind of push them off to the side rather than affirm what God is doing in them and through them. Now, the larger story of the Bible, the story of Jephthah, pushes us to ask more questions about what it means to live as people who reflect God's revelation of himself as a God of life. Our contemporary testimony talks about treating life with awe and respect, especially when it's most vulnerable, and it gives some good examples. If we're looking for practical things to do in order to affirm a value of life, abortion, pollution, gluttony, all of these things that we, not just things that happen out there policy-wise, but they're things that happen in our own lives and in our own circles. How do we care for that kind of vulnerability? But in these words, we also find a reminder of God's own grace for us. It's interesting that this deeply flawed hero of this story, Jephthah, is one on whom the Spirit of the Lord comes in verse 29. And again, the Spirit of the Lord can come on us in the same way, to try to prompt us to say, here's an area where you can care for others in our world. Here's an area where you can try to protect those who are vulnerable because of their health, because of their economics, because of their disability. Here's an area where perhaps the decisions that you make might affect somebody who's living in poverty in another part of the world. And these words remind us of God's grace for us. God, of course, shaped us in our mother's wombs. As the psalmist reminds us in Psalm 104, when God takes away breath, people die. Animals die as creatures die. We are that dependent on God for every breath we take. But more than that, we're spiritually vulnerable creatures. As the Apostle John reminds us, the Son of God did not enter our world. If God did not take the initiative to lift us out of our death and save us, we would perish instead of having eternal life. So it's not just providence. It's not just God's kind of general care for the world, that he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous and so on. That's not the main thing that should make us care for life with awe and respect, but it's a story of salvation that God reached out to us when we were dying and lifted us up. And it's God's special care for spiritually vulnerable creatures that moves us to respond with thanks by finding joy in the life that God gives. Care for the vulnerable. Not just through the policies that are out there, although that in itself is that as well, but ways that we confront abuse or challenge cultures where domestic violence can grow. What are these ways that we can be instruments of God's life for us? A while back, someone shared with me an article by a young woman whose heart God had converted as an adult, but who still struggled with the church's position on abortion in particular. She was pro-choice, and she said, being pro-choice is motivated out of love. A love for women with unwanted pregnancies, a love for babies who, if they were born, would be unwanted. And again, we have to hear those stories too as a church. Not that it takes away from the ethic of life, but to hear the struggle that the circumstances bring. But for this young woman, she said the Christian ethic never clicked until her husband commented to her one day, I guess everyone is really pro-life. It's just that we tend to be pro our own life. I think about how easy it is to be pro my own life. Never think about the impact of decisions that I make, of what to buy, where to go, where to travel, and never think about what that impact that has on people who live in poverty in the third world that are making the things that I'm buying. Or to come home so wrapped up in my own thoughts that I don't really think about the lives of those in my family who are affected by myself, my self-centeredness in that moment. We are pro our own life. Without God's grace to kind of shake us up and make us see that, it's no wonder that we make decisions that affect the lives of others in negative ways. God calls us to something more. In fact, he models it himself in redemption. Jesus, we're told, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he humbled himself and made himself nothing, became obedient even to death on a cross. It's that story that drove the early church to become well known, even regarded as kind of odd by many of its contemporaries in the first couple of centuries, for their willingness to adopt children, discarded by others, for their persistence in opposing gladiator games. Having been rescued by Christ from slavery to sin, Jesus' followers would engage in their own rescue mission out of concern for those whom society would discard as inconvenient, burdensome, worthless, those who are vulnerable like Jephthah's daughter. God used Jephthah to accomplish great things. But those great things were overshadowed by his careless ethic of life, his dumb promise. The question is, what do we think about today? Where do our minds go when we think about life? Which lives are we concerned about, or are we mainly concerned about our own? Are we thinking about an ethic of life that reflects the work of Christ's redemption within us? Now, thankfully, God also made a promise. We think about that promise that he made here this morning, a promise that looks at the problem of death in the world and says, you know what, I can bring life even out of that. And it's that promise that we cling to this morning as we come to worship, as we celebrate the Lord's Supper together. My prayer is that we today, who have an even greater vision than Jephthah, of God's revelation and God's care for his people, God's life-giving gift of grace through Jesus Christ, would find ourselves moved in response to be compassionate advocates for life today. And to do so out of worship, not manipulating God to accomplish our own political goals, but to keep our word when it hurts. To care for those around us in the world because they matter to us and to God. When we speak rashly, let's throw ourselves on God's mercy rather than causing others around us to suffer. And in all of these things, let us never have our stories become larger than the story of God's redemption, his victory over the forces of sin and evil in the world. Let's pray. Lord, it's hard to understand